When I first heard of this book years and years ago, I really didn't know much about it, and all I knew was that it was a true crime novel. I think it was in a list of good true crime books, and I saw it and was like, fair enough, that's all I need to know. And then a couple of years ago, I saw it in a secondhand store, and it was like $3, so I picked it up, and it's sat on my shelf ever since. And every time I look at it, I just have the vague association of it being a true crime book with no other information known to me. So when I started reading it, I was really surprised to find out that it's not really a true crime book at all. I mean, yes, a crime takes place in the story, but Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil has a subtitle, which is a Savannah story, and that truly is what the book is. Savannah is a city in Georgia on the coast. I had never heard of this city before. I'm, Australian. It's not a particularly famous American city, at least not internationally. The whole almost first half of the book is just about Savannah and this writer, this New York writer, and his experience going into the town and falling down the rabbit hole of Savannah culture, atmosphere of Savannah, of the town, I keep saying a town, it's not, it's a city, but it's so quiet and so isolated in a lot of ways, purposefully isolated, that it has this feeling as you're reading of a kind of quiet town, but it has, tens of thousands of people living there, hundreds of thousands. The first 10 or 12 chapters are just a long line of eccentric characters who you can't believe are real people. And they're even more intriguing because it's true. I probably wouldn't have bought half the stories, the anecdotes, if it wasn't a nonfiction book. And it's not just the characters that we meet, but it's also the stories they tell of other people in the town, from high society to new money to old money to the performers and drag queen culture. Half the book is setting up this world, and then the crime takes place. The first character we meet is Jim Williams, who has made his money in his lifetime through buying and selling antiques, and so he's considered new money, but he makes his way into the high society of Savannah and yet keeps himself distant from many of their traditions so that he can still feel superior to them. This is a quote. He says, "What I enjoy most is living like an aristocrat without the burden of having to be one. Blue bloods are so inbred and weak, all those generations of importance and grandeur to live up to. No wonder they lack ambition. I don't envy them. It's only the trappings of aristocracy that I find worthwhile. The fine furniture, the paintings, the silver, the very things they have to sell when the money runs out, and it always does. Then all they're left with is their lovely manners." Another character is Joe Odom, who is sort of the lovable con man. I can't describe him any other way. And what I find funny is that throughout the book, he will joke with John Berendt about this book becoming a movie and him becoming the protagonist and the likable lead. And this book did become a movie, and I don't think Joe Odom was the lead in any way, but he was a really great character. There's also Luther Diggers, who is sort of this very depressed, sad inventor who also clings to the power of this vague threat to drug all of Savannah in the water supply. People are very scared, or vaguely scared, about this loose threat. Interesting to me about this Luther Diggers guy is that he never assuages anyone's fears of this happening. He clings to the threat almost as if it's a part of his identity. What I found interesting was that John Berendt didn't just interview and speak with and become involved with the sort of higher ups of the society. He also kind of went into the underbelly, but it was a very specific underbelly, and that of performers. He meets and follows around Emma Calley, who's a performer in her 70s who remembers everyone's favourite song and starts playing it as soon as they enter the building. He also meets Chablis, I'm not quite sure how to say her name, I think it's Chablis, who's a black trans woman and drag queen who kind of pulls herself into the story by demanding John Berendt be her chauffeur and drive her around because she doesn't have a car. And John Berendt, it's kind of like, I don't really want to be like super involved with this person, but she is so charismatic that she just kind of pulls him into her orbit and becomes a part of the narrative. And then the story takes a shift, the crime happens. I don't really want to talk about that, just not only because it's a spoiler and I would love people to read this book, but also because as I said, I don't think it's the focus of the story, and it's not the most interesting part of this book for me. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It was captivating, and I kept running back to it each night to read some more, and I loved it. You could feel the warm, dappled sunlight of Savannah on every page, the grandeur, but also the stagnation of the city. It felt like a place you could fall into because of its beautiful simplicity, but then look up and see 30 years had passed and you haven't evolved, haven't been challenged at all, because this city loves what it is, and for that it is beautiful, but it is also very steeped in maintaining what is already there. And that brings me to a guy called Lee Adler, who was one of the most interesting people in the book for me, because he kind of has two sides to him. There are two stories of who Lee Adler is. There's the story Lee Adler tells, and then there's the story everyone else tells about him. Lee Adler was very involved in the historic restoration of the city, of certain buildings and certain sections, and as he says it, he has done a huge amount of work in restoring the city and making sure that these old buildings, these old landmarks have been maintained and restored. And one of the most contentious things he was involved with was he restored the Victorian sector, the Victorian building sector in the city, and kept the subsidised housing there for underprivileged people, primarily black people. And as far as he's concerned, like, that's a good thing. I've given these people, these underprivileged people, a home, and just because this town is racist, they perceive it as bad. The other side of that, namely, rich white people, say that he did all of this without any consultation of the historic restoration boards. He did this for his own ego, and he did a poor job of restoring the buildings, the Victorian buildings, and he's basically ghettoized the people into their own, subsection of the city. I found that chapter of looking at these events from two different perspectives, that chapter is the reason why I love nonfiction, because it's never simple. True stories, nonfiction, they are complicated because real life is complicated, and one action can mean different things to different people, and all of those interpretations can be a fair interpretation of those actions. And I like that complexity in nonfiction. Since I loved this book so much, after I finished it, I looked it up because, as I said, I knew almost nothing about the book going into it. And I looked it up to see what others had to say because I assumed other people would have enjoyed it as much as I did. And I found out two things. First, this book was insanely massive in the 90s. It was published in 1994, and I had no idea how big this book is. I knew that a movie had been made, but lots of, mid-listing books have been made into movies. This was a phenomenon. It sold millions of copies, and it created an entire tourism industry for people who have read this book and then go travel in Savannah. And I can see why. I would love to go to Savannah. I had no idea the place existed. Of course, I realized that, if I did end up going to Savannah in my life, it would not be the Savannah of this book. Not only is this book set in the 80s, but it is also a construction. It is also an interpretation and a written down atmospheric version of Savannah. But the second thing that I found when I looked up this book is the controversy around this book, that John Berendt didn't write it accurately. He took liberties in how he structured the story, and that kind of shattered me. It kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. I was not expecting it because it felt so real as I was reading, and an example of how he sort of twisted the truth is that the writer, he writes as if he moved to the town, he got sucked into the culture, he stayed there many, many years, and then this crime happens and he follows the story from there. But that's not true. The writer, he wasn't living in the city years before the crime took place, as is heavily implied, as is written as text. It's not subtext, it's text. He amalgamates events and he changes timelines, and it turns out he actually moved to the city years after the crime took place. And so there's this chapter midway through the book where he finds out about the crime. It's chapter 11, Newsflash, and admittedly it's only a 3-page chapter, but it's where, sort of spoilers, I won't tell you what the crime is, but he finds out by Chabley ringing him and saying, hey, have you heard about this thing that's happened? And that chapter is completely fabricated. That didn't happen. And that really frustrates me. It annoys me. It leaves a sour taste in my mouth. It makes me think of the James Frey and Oprah Winfrey scandal. So James Frey wrote a book called A Million Little Pieces, which admittedly I have not read. I just know the legendary story. And he wrote this memoir, and Oprah picked it as her Oprah Book Club, and it was a big deal at the time because at that point Oprah had really only been picking classics to read in her book club, and this was the first contemporary new release that she had picked. And James Frey wrote this memoir about alcoholism and going to rehab and trying to become sober. And I heard about all of this, not at the time, I was, a tiny child, but subsequently I've learned about this story and this controversy, and I fundamentally think it is wrong to write a memoir and knowingly lie in it. I understand that memoir and memory is inherently, biased and inherently inaccurate because of the way memory works, but because of how our brains interact with narrative. But I think you should tell at least your truth in a memoir. That is what a memoir should be. It should be the truth of someone's story. And I agree with, and I feel that way even more strongly with something like narrative nonfiction, which is what Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil should be. Part of the appeal is knowing that all that I am reading is true, at least if it's someone's truth. At least it's the truth of someone's experience. And to take advantage of that appeal without the studious work involved to achieve it is not fair, in my opinion. It cheapens the work and it shortchanges the reader. It really coloured how I viewed this book. I absolutely adored this book. I thought the writing was fantastic. I ripped through it. I haven't been reading very well recently for months. I've been sort of in a reading slump, and this book single-handedly got me out of it. It made me read ferociously like I haven't read in a long time. The pacing, the atmosphere, the weirdness, I loved it. And I find out this and I feel wholeheartedly hypocritical because I had such a strong feeling or opinion on the James Frey matter, admittedly not having ever read his book. And now here I am, a book that I personally love is in the same category of twisted truth, of fabricated nonfiction. I hate it. I wish it was true. I wish he had have just brought his brilliant writing talent and written the story as it had have happened. What is wrong with him coming to the town a few years after the crime took place? I don't see the problem with that. I would say that the cliche, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed, but I'm angry. I'm also angry. I believe that labels mean something, and if you call your book a non-fiction, it should be a bloody non-fiction. Perhaps that's naive or short-sighted creatively, I don't know. And it brings me to an interesting topic, which I think is the author's presence or non-presence in this book. For a lot of this book, he's kind of this invisible shadow. He's the person that people are speaking to. He's not a person that actually speaks. And I found it really interesting. The writing of this book has this weird sort of disconnected, meandering feeling, almost like I imagine him just like this sort of leaf in the wind, just sort of blowing about to different parts of this town. He seemed like the sort of person that people just opened up to and shared so much to quite easily. And by him shutting up his mouth and not inserting himself into the story, he got all of the richness of the story that was already there from the people who lived there. Really, the only part of the book where the author has a significant presence is in the story with Chablis. She interacts with him, and she doesn't just pull herself into the story, she pulls the author into the story too. There's a section later on in the book where Chablis sort of rocks up somewhere where she sort of isn't meant to be, and John Berendt is kind of freaking out. And it's really the only time in the book where I felt like I wasn't just aware of the author's presence, but I felt like I was experiencing the story specifically through his own experience. Throughout the rest of the book, I'm not really aware of John Berendt at all, and I liked that. I liked that this story was not about him, it was about everyone else. But now that I know this controversy, I wonder, like, perhaps that was just an easy escape for him. If he did insert his own story into the narrative, he wouldn't be able to fabricate it the way he did. I really did love this book, and I do recommend it. It is a unique read in a multitude of ways, and I still love the book. I want to reread it. I'm so glad I purchased it. But I can't deny that this whole twisting of the facts thing, it leaves a sour taste in my mouth, and it has coloured my entire experience of the book, as it would. Reading nonfiction is always coloured by it being nonfiction, and I think if you mess with that, if you mess with the integrity of that, it changes your work. And I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't respect the genre that you're working in. There is a difference between claiming your book is true when it isn't. And I guess that's all I wanted to say.